John, do you want to introduce him again? Maybe
oh,
pronounce
goody.
his name right this time?
Yeah.
Oh, that's not going to happen.
Hello and welcome to Storyweavers, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything story-related.
Here, we'll delve into inspiration, plot, structure, character, and dialogue. Be it in books, movies, music, comics, television, or anything else, we'll be covering it from conception to reception.
We'll be discussing between ourselves as well as with other creators and fans about their experiences, routines, and techniques. Join us and find your next inspiration. We're your hosts, Dean Bradley
and John William Worth.
And this is Storyweavers.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Storyweavers, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything story-related. Today, we have a special guest, Josh Pomponio. I almost did it again. Wonderful. He's a filmmaker, photographer, I would like to say. Correct, Josh?
Sure. Yeah, I do a bit of everything.
That's good. And this is going to be a two-part episode. In this part, we'll be discussing his love for film, and particularly for Orson Welles. And in the second part, we'll be discussing his own film, Analogic, which takes a lot of cues from Orson Welles, as well as other filmmakers. So Josh, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Of course. It's good to have you here. We've the three of us have known each other for quite a while now, so it's fun to have you on here and talk about some of the more creative side of our personalities.
Yeah, we always have interesting conversations, whether it's on front of camera or just the three of us chatting. So I'm looking forward to diving into these subjects with you guys.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Perfect.
let's get into it. So, I know you're a big fan of Orson Welles. Just maybe a little bit of background for people who aren't as familiar with Welles. Who was Orson Welles, and why are you so fascinated by him?
Well, Orson Welles is first and foremost an American filmmaker from starting from the 1940s all the way to the 1980s, I guess you could say. He had a really long career as both an actor, director, writer, performer. He at the age of 25, he co-wrote, produced, directed, and starred in what is now considered, one of the greatest films ever made, Citizen Kane. And he developed a really unique visual style that has influenced, probably every filmmaker that has come since. Whether it's in America or France, he's had a really long-lasting effect on American cinema, and has inspired other filmmakers who have also later on inspired other generations of filmmakers. So he's a really, really powerful, really big, literally and figuratively figure in American, not just American cinema, but I think in American history in general, for sure.
Just
and world cinema,
entertainment. And I know from the few films of his I've seen, there are a lot of political undertones in them as well. So that definitely helped, I think, define a lot of his work too. Maybe a little more subtextually than some people realize, but
yeah, the politics are really subtle in his film, but also really powerful at the same time. And I think, unfortunately, particularly with Citizen Kane, there's been an attempt to depoliticize him, because even though I think nowadays, and maybe in more recent history, culturally, his politics are more widespread and more common. In 1941, he was really the odd man out for kind of American politics, and maybe not totally American politics, but at least in Hollywood, his politics were much more progressive than he's given credit for. And Kane, in particular, is a much more politically progressive film than I think we want to realize.
I mean, with Citizen Kane, at least he was going after, who was the newspaper mogul? I forget the name at
Hearst,
the moment.
William Randolph
Hearst, yeah. And I think at that time it was considered unusual to kind of like mimic someone else's life, even in a fictional sense, warts and all. And Hearst led the charge to be like, no, this is really, really bad. So, I mean, that was daring in and of itself. I don't know, maybe political, but he pushed a lot of boundaries, like you mentioned. He changed cinema and the way you tell stories with film.
For sure. Yeah, the film was definitely linked, forever to Hearst. Unfortunately for Hearst, who tried to, destroy the film and had this huge, campaign against it. And at one point,
He was booed at the Oscars.
yeah, and he
Oh, wow.
pressured the heads of all the major studios to pull their money together and buy the negative from RKO in order to destroy it. And it was really it was really close to coming to that. Wells had to do a lot of kind of campaigning behind the scenes with the people at RKO, not just studio people, but also like the shareholders of the studio. One of who had a pretty big shareholding in the studio was Nelson Rockefeller, and the Rockefellers were kind of enemies with Hearst, and I think I think Nelson Rockefeller, maybe behind the scenes, didn't, he persuaded the board to not sell to her, not to cave to Hearst, because there was that kind of political fighting going on. He didn't want to win, he didn't want to lose to Hearst, he didn't want to have Hearst have that kind of influence. And
yeah, I remember there was one story I had read somewhere that Hearst at some point Wells had heard that Hearst had hired like a prostitute to ambush him in his hotel room, and that a photographer would be there to take the picture just to show them like in cahoots, and that he would want a smear campaign against Orson Welles. Yeah, so Orson Welles stayed in another hotel that night, and there was no knowing if that was true or not. So that man was willing to do anything to try to bury this movie.
Yeah.
An interesting question I just want to throw at you, because Citizen Kane, as we've said before, you look at it now and it's a very, very normal movie by today's eye. But back then it was revolutionary in a lot of its techniques. It wasn't recognized for that for a very, very long time. Like I think until the 60s or 70s. I'm almost tempted to say. Do you think some of that was because of Hearst trying to bury the movie? Or do you think people just truly didn't recognize it for how masterful and how ahead of its time it was?
I don't think it's entirely due to Hearst, because at the time, it didn't do well financially. It got really good reviews at the time. It was if you read more of the contemporary reviews, it's surprising how right they kind of were. Like a lot of people at the time recognized its achievement. They didn't quite say it's the greatest film of all time, because it was still kind of a new art form. But I think one of the reasons why it didn't really why it kind of took some time to age and took some time to come into its own right is kind of Wells' subsequent career after Kane. Magnificent Ambersons wasn't a really big success. They totally recut that movie, and because of the drama and the damage to his reputation after Kane, he was unable to really finalize
Had a hard time finding
Ambersons
funding.
Yeah, not necessarily funding, but to finalize Emerson's and even his project in Brazil, which his project in Brazil, It's All True, I think did more damage, or maybe just as much damage to his reputation and career as the fallout from Citizen Kane, because at the end of his time in Brazil, like the 6-month period, the press, kind of at Hearst's insistence, and also the Hollywood insiders who didn't really appreciate this young, he was 25 when he made Kane, 26 I think when he was in Brazil doing his whole adventure, and 27 when he came back. So the establishment didn't really like his kind of maverick sensibilities, and not just Hearst with his own newspapers, but also the insider kind of columns and writing. They really tarnished his reputation because of what they perceived as his flamboyant nature in Brazil, going over schedule, going over budget, when in reality, RKO never told him what kind of money he had. They were actually guaranteed money from the government, because it was a government funded basically project. Right. It's All True, to go to Brazil. And I think the part of the contract was that the government would pay all the expenses up to a certain amount that RKO accrued. And at the time, everyone's like, "Oh, Wells, spent $1 million. He, went over budget." But I think Joseph McBride found out like in the 80s and 90s going through like RKO archives that he wasn't even near the maximum budget that the government would subsidize. He was actually way under budget, and RKO weren't dispersing funds to him that he was kind of contractually obligated to have at his disposal. But that kind of behavior, followed him for the rest of his life, whether or not it's justified. This idea that he would go out without a script, without no money, run out of money, go find money elsewhere, which, it's something that's partially true, but it all comes from the fallout from Kane and from It's All True, and he was just never able to overcome that damage to his reputation.
Huh. I didn't know any of that.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, at least when it comes to Welles, the big ones they know Citizen Kane, they know War of the Worlds. What were some of like the techniques he introduced? We'll start with Citizen Kane, and we can move on to some of his other films because he's got a big filmography. But what were some of the things that? Why do people say Citizen Kane is the best movie ever made in terms of filmmaking, in terms of story, in terms of how he uses music? I mean, he used different audio techniques, video techniques.
Cinematography,
tell us a little bit about
the editing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's considered the greatest because it's 100% at all of those kind of levels. He really pioneered the use in America of wide angle lenses. He shot Citizen Kane with a 24 millimeter lens almost exclusively, which is, quite wide for the period when most people were using either 50 or 35. Playing scenes, entirely without any kind of cutting. There's several scenes that go on where characters are walking in and out, the camera's moving, and all of that was really revolutionary at the time, and kind of even still today. The standard aesthetic is, if a person's talking, you have a medium or close up on them, you go to a reaction shot, or then go to a close up on someone else. There several scenes in Kane run for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes without a single cut. Which is very innovative at the time. Another thing I think is sound. I think Wells is such a great visual director that people overlook how pioneering, even particularly with Kane, how pioneering his sound technique was, and that comes from his radio days. Like War of the Worlds and other. Was doing radio for years. While he was doing Broadway shows before we went to Hollywood. And the idea that you could have sound, act as a transition, sound cues acting at, enhancing the quality of the size of the set or showing the passage of time. There's a great scene in Kane when he's first adopted, he's given a sled, like another sled. And the camera pans up at Thatcher, and Thatcher says, "Merry Christmas, Charles," and it cuts back down to young Kane, and he says, "Merry Christmas," and then it cuts to older Thatcher now, like 20 years later,
and a
Happy New Year, and that kind of jump transition, it's really unique. It's really unique for a movie in 1941, but that's something common that Wells would do. That's a very audio. You could have your eyes closed, and then you can know that, okay, you hear a younger voice and then an older voice, continuing the phrase. You can know only from the audio that 25 years has passed or something.
And the story being told out of order. Also, I mean, for every vignette, every person that the reporter interviews, and you never really see the interviewer's face, which since you just noticed, you just remarked the lack of reaction shots. You never really see his face. Perfect audience stand-in, but with every vignette, it's like we always go back to the beginning, and you see some events from different perspectives. And I mean, at the time, I could imagine that might have thrown audiences for a bit of a loop. Like, what? Everything's told out of order? Just
in terms of continuity, what's going on when you've never really been exposed to that. Really, probably outside of maybe some books here and there.
Maybe, but the other thing, like how you just said, Josh, like Wells is coming from radio, and all of the people around him came from, the Mercury Theater. And that's almost the opposite of what we're taught to do in film, or what film is supposed to do. It's like show, don't tell. Here he is saying you can show and tell, or sometimes tell and not necessarily show. Like, you don't have to play. There's no hard and fast rules when he went into this film, his first film.
And I think it's interesting because years later, Wells would say that the idea of having the nonlinear story, he wanted to be a bit more like he said Rashomon because by then Rashomon had come out, the Japanese film. But
Kurosawa.
Originally, you would see the opinion of Kane would change depending on who was telling the story. Like if the person who loved him, you see a loving picture; person who hated him, you see a hating picture. But he thought that Kane is shown more or less as how he is. And originally, the idea of having that structure, he wanted to have different perspectives, and so you would have kind of a less clear idea of who Kane was. And I think to do that in 1941 would have been, really crazy on his part, really, really outstanding. But for whatever reason, it fell out of the script at some point, and you see Kane for who he is in the
just
like
movie. A flat perspective, even though it's told from various points of view. We'd like to take this brief break to announce the next book of the month for December 2023. This book is going to be Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton Trumbo. Published in 1939, it's the aftermath of a soldier's time on the battlefields of Europe in World War I. This is a very personal book for me because I read it many, many years ago in high school. It was introduced to me by a friend of mine named Gabby who had just read it and was absolutely floored by it. She told me, you have to read this book. It will change your perspective on a lot of things. And I will say that as short as it seems and as simple as it's written, it definitely did. So when I was given the chance to recommend a book for Book of the Month, this was one of the first ones that popped into my mind. So I'm looking forward to rereading it, and I'm looking forward to not only hearing Dean's response to the book, but also hearing all of your responses if you're following along and reading with us. We'll be releasing the episode at the end of the month, so if you're following along, please, if you're not already subscribed to the podcast, please subscribe on YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, whatever your preferred preference of platform is, and definitely tune in for that episode to hear our thoughts, and hopefully you'll want to share yours as well. Now, back to the episode.
And I think one of the things we've actually, I don't even know if we've mentioned it yet, but one of the reasons Wells stands out as well is he wasn't just a director and a cinematographer, but he starred in many of his own movies as an actor. Which I think is something important to talk about as well.
And he did that in theater and radio. He started out more as an actor in the theater. He lied about his age in Dublin. When he was 15, he said he was 24 and a big Broadway success. When he was traveling around Dublin on his inheritance.
Fake it till you make it.
And that's why he smoked cigars, because he wanted to look older. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah. He started out as an actor. And then when he kind of started doing more American theater, that's when he became more of a director, and and then doing directing in radio, and then eventually film. So he really started out as an actor, but I don't think he really liked acting, that much. I think he really wanted to be, at least in film, he wanted to direct more. But his persona had developed even at that young age of his early 20s, that people expected to see him. And it's really interesting. Kane, he is the central figure, but he doesn't appear in the Magnificent Ambersons. He's the narrator of the story, so his presence is still there with his voice, and it's not like it's the voice of like the narrator. It's clearly Orson Welles telling the story. He's not trying to hide the fact that it's himself. It's Orson Welles telling the story of the Magnificent Ambersons. And I think that's really only one of two movies that he directed that he didn't act in. The other one would be the Other Side of the Wind, which he almost acted in that one, but he convinced John Huston to do it instead. And but yeah, I think he really only acted later on to get the money for his films. I think acting was kind of secondary, and he would always talk about how his personality only narrowed him to play, or only allowed him to play these kind of narrow parts, like these king parts. They're not necessarily the best parts, but his personality is the personality of the king or the person in power. And so he was really kind of limited to playing those kind of parts. And he was aware of that,
That's very big. Like how like you said, he was aware of his limited range. And it's like, to embrace it, that's very important, because you get a lot of actors who try to act outside of their range and it just doesn't work, whereas he just fully embraced it. And you know, just something I wanted to mention also about Citizen Kane and like about a bunch of his movies, because one thing I like looking for in like older films is the type of acting on display, whether you get like that transatlantic kind of very stiff-backed acting, like, hello, how are you? Or you get a more naturalistic kind of acting that you started seeing in the 60s with Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And you kind of start seeing that in Citizen Kane. There's like individual moments where you can see it kind of like breaks through that like Hays Code like mold, and it becomes much more natural. And like you mentioning that, how it's like acting might have been secondary to him. It's like, was it part of the fact that he was just kind of doing himself? So it was kind of like, okay, I'm just going to do this. Why not? You know? So.
Yeah, there's the one scene when after Kane loses the election, he's speaking with Jed Leland, who is in real life Joseph Cotton, was like his real life best friend.
The low angle looking up
the
scene.
low angle.
Oh, yeah,
and there's a part that they were shooting it late at night, and Joseph Cotton had been in New York doing rehearsing for a play, and he had just flown, you know, probably taken him like, you know, 10 or 12 hours back at the time, but he had just come in. He had been up for almost 24 hours by the time they were shooting that scene, so he was dead tired. And as they were filming, he makes and it's in the film. He flubs his line. He goes,
chromatic criticism.
I want to do dramatic chromatism, and you could see Welles kind of smiling, laughing, and he didn't yell cut. And Joe Cotton just kept going, you know, and he says dramatic. Oh, you know what I mean? That was all improvised. That happened naturally.
At the time, that's like unheard of with film costs and everything. Not until like On the Waterfront, where you got like Marlon Brando picking up the glove and playing with it during the scene. Like, you didn't see anything spontaneous like that back then.
Right. Yeah, and Welles loved little happy accidents. That's what he said a director really does, is that the director is someone who just presides over a series of happy accidents, and any time like a little accident like that would happen, he would love it, and he would keep it in the film. And you know, there's one story that his daughter told about in Chimes at Midnight, where they were shooting just the shot that would only be in like the opening credits. There's you know, people walking, like soldiers walking, and one of the extras was really just the waiter that Welles had admired from his favorite restaurant, and he thought he just had such a wonderful face, he had to be just somewhere in the film, so he had him at the tail end of this line of soldiers walking, and a big gust of wind came and knocked his hat off. And you know, according to his daughter, any professionally trained actor would have yelled, "Oh crap! You know, cut! We got to start. We got to do it again." And Welles let the camera going. The hack was off, and the guy stops, you know, kind of runs after, picks up, puts it back on his head, and keeps walking forward, keeps going through the scene. And Welles was roaring with laughter. He loved it, and it ends up, you know, it's one of the first shots in the movie, and you know, this like total accident. Yeah, he loved things like that. He loved like any kind of mistake.
In life.
And that's something you don't see in a lot of more professional films that have you know, really strict structures.
Yeah. I love Chimes at Midnight or Falstaff, whatever you want to call it. I love that movie, Henry IV, Henry V. I mean, I love the plays that they're based on, and the fact that he was able to take something so well known, make it seem, you know, some quote historically accurate. You know, it looked like it was in the time period. He followed word for word, you know, what Shakespeare had written, but he somehow was able to change the focus of the story, and took a minor secondary character and kind of, I don't know if I'd call him the lead role, but definitely gave him a bigger presence in those plays and in the film than Shakespeare had.
Yeah, Falstaff was a figure Welles was obsessed with, you know, his whole life. He started as a play called Five Kings in 1938 or 39, and he played the role of Falstaff at 24 years old in heavy makeup on the stage. And you know, he tried for years to do it as a play several times, because initially it failed. And he kept all the sets in storage for I think maybe like 10 or 15 years, and paid out of his own pocket, you know, all that time to keep that initial set, because he wanted to do it eventually. And then
so
he did it later on.
That's why we have a film instead of a play for it. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and he did the play again in Dublin in the 60s with Keith Baxter as Hal, and I think some of the other people that would end up in the movie were also in the play. But he had discovered Keith Baxter for the stage play. And at one point, as they were wrapping up the play, he goes, he was preparing to do the movie, and he goes, Keith, we're going to do the movie, but like I'm not going to do the movie if you're not going to be Hal. And he was insisting that he join him for the movie, and and Keith Baxter later said that he felt that the play was just a preparation for the movie that they were going to do. When they were doing the play, he didn't quite have Wells didn't have the plan to do anything for it, but he could tell that this was something that Wells was so passionate for that he was going to try and do a movie of it, and of course that ended up being his masterpiece.
I love it. I think it was. I mean, I think it was the first Wells movie I had seen and like sat down and paid attention to the whole time through. And as soon as it ended, like I just started it again. There are very few movies I've done that with. I just absolutely fell in love with that movie.
Yeah, it's something that you're kind of left speechless. You feel like you're kind of punched in the gut at the end of that movie because the emotions are so high, and then it's such a it's a really devastating and brutal movie emotionally. It's probably the most emotional movie, the most personal movie you can see in his oeuvre, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing I wanted to mention, because Brad, you had mentioned how Wells stayed really true to like the dialogue, which is true. Wordly he would stay true to Shakespeare's lines, but he would always take parts of other Shakespeare plays and put them in others. He did that with Falstaff. He took lines from like I think The Merry Wives of Windsor, which is another play that Falstaff appears in that's not related to Henry the King plays. And even in his theater days, he would take parts from. One time he was doing Julius Caesar, and he took a whole scene, a whole like soliloquy from I think Titus Andronicus. He took this whole soliloquy, gave it to a whole other character in Caesar, and made it in the middle of the thing. And even his film of Macbeth, he created a whole new character of the holy priest, and he made Catholic or Christianity this overwhelming presence in his film, which it's again nowhere in the text of Shakespeare is there anything about kind of Christianity, but he created this whole other character and gave him lines from 3 or 4 other characters in Macbeth and also other lines from other Shakespeare plays to create this presence of Christianity really out of nowhere. And he did that all the time. He did that. Not quite as much, I think, in Falstaff because of how much he appreciated that character. But I think in Othello he did that too. He did that really in Macbeth, and all through his theater days. He felt no kind of strict reverence for the text. If he thought it would help the story, he would cut pages. He would cut characters. Othello as a play, I think it's like a 3-hour long play. His movie is 90 minutes. His movie is like 92 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah.
He cut a lot of, he
very
felt
economical.
Yeah.
And was most of that for artistic reasons or for budget reasons or for audiences not wanting to sit in a movie for 3 hours? Or
well, I think it's more artistic. Othello in particular, I've never seen a full version of the play, but from what I've read is that Iago has a lot of lines where he is kind of summarizing what is happening, and Iago speaks to the audience. And so I think a lot of what Othello in particular, Wells cut was more theatrical kind of stuff that you don't need in a visual, in a cinematic movie. You can do things, you can tell in a certain shot or a glance, you could tell certain things that the character on a stage play would have to speak.
Right.
Yep.
And I think even Falstaff and Macbeth, he did similar things. He would things that were you would need in a stage in order, like someone describing the scene of the ships attacking or the ships coming. Wells had model ships, that kind of thing. So,
like how you were mentioning about like the stage play, it's like I just immediately thought of like Kenneth Branagh, how he made I think it was Henry V and Hamlet, and both. I think it was Henry V. He took scenes from Henry IV and moved them into the movie because it's you can show these things. You don't need a character explaining them to you. And the same went with his Hamlet production. And then the other thing, how you were mentioning, like, about Wells' stage days, I remembered a tidbit I read about Touch of Evil, which is one of my favorite of Wells' films visually. Like, I just like watching the camera work in that movie. A story that I guess he rehearsed his cast for about 2 weeks before the film started production. They went through the whole script and they rewrote parts of it. And they just kind of like the characters were already on the page, but they created the characters and they created the story kind of as they went along, a lot like what Sidney Lumet did with like Dog Day Afternoon.
So not to interrupt you, it's just to go off of that, because I'm not a film guy, as you guys know, and you both are. Is that not normal to like prepare a movie in that way leading up to production? To prepare,
yes, but maybe not to that extent.
Okay.
And also to allow, this is in my perspective, like, to allow the actors to have so much leeway. And that probably comes from Wells's background as an actor. He knows what it's like on both sides. So it's like, if Janet Leigh couldn't do a scene the way it was written, how can we have Janet Leigh be able to do it? It's like, she's a terrific actress. Same with Charlton Heston. So yeah, I just thought of those two things, and I forget exactly where I was going with this, but that happens.
Well, Wells did that on almost every shoot he did. He was always constantly rewriting. He was always adapting to circumstance, whether it was due to, shortage of funds or a happy accident or an idea someone else had. He was always willing to change what he had prepared. He always prepared his films in a lot of great detail. That way that way he allowed himself to be able to be kind of free
Experiment.
to those those moments. Yeah. And with his acting troupe, even in Touch of Evil, any of his American films, he really worked with the kind of the same core group of actors that, not only were they working on like the same films, but they had started all like in theater. Wells met Joseph Kahn in the theater in 1935, 36, and he ends up in Touch of Evil too. He ends up in F for Fake. So
I love that
there's
movie.
a lot of actors that even in his European career, there's quite a few actors who made several movies with him, and he liked them. I think he always wanted to work with his friends, but he also had a really interesting set of actor friends, like Akeem Tamaroff, who was in Touch of Evil as Grandy. He's a really weird weird looking guy, to be on a movie. But Wells always used him in a way that really was really fitting for him in the story, whether it's in Arcadon or Touch of Evil. He shows up in The Trial. He was Sancho Panza in his unfinished Don Quixote. So he really knew how to get the most out of these interesting actor friends that he had in his life.
So I didn't know that he rehearsed his actors like that, but I knew that he had like that surrounding of the same people, and that he always used their strength. So the other thing I remembered about, reading about the rehearsal times and the scripts for Touch of Evil, was that he purposely wanted to confuse and kind of infuriate the audience with how complicated the film was. And that it was just funny thinking of that after how you mentioned one of his Shakespeare at Othello, I think you said, where it's like 90 minutes and the stage plays like 3 hours. And then just like how we were discussing about Citizen Kane, how deeply metaphorical a lot of parts of that movie are, not only the use of light and shadow, but also just the script, and how, the sled, his dear Rosebud being replaced by a brand new sled. And that's like the end of his childhood. And it's just, I remember from my film school days, so a lot of arrogance, people trying to say with some films that Orson Welles kind of valued style over substance at times. Not really a question, just something that I remember hearing from a lot of my peers in the early 2000s, looking back on a lot of his film work.
Yeah, that kind of touches on one of the questions. I think we had touched on it earlier, but we had talked a little bit about it with Citizen Kane, but things that lots of people have gotten wrong about Wells and their perception of his character and his style and his way of
his visual, audio, storytelling style.
Yeah, and it's really strange too, because if you look at Wells's films, he doesn't do a lot of, in his early films, he does a lot of the long take. He does a lot of camera moves. So he does things that don't necessarily he were in his opinion, like draw attention to itself. That was always his big concern with his style of filmmaking. He always liked the film to look to not draw attention to itself as a medium, and I think that's why he liked long takes, is that the audience is paying attention to the story that's happening and the characters acting, and not necessarily the camera movements. And I was actually just watching Touch of Evil yesterday with the one commentary track by James Nairmore and Jonathan Rosenbaum, two great cinema scholars, also really fantastic books on Wells, and they were commenting about how the opening shot of Touch of Evil is iconic now. It's a legendary 3.5 minute shot. We have camera movements, moving all these hundreds of extras and stuff. And Wells, apparently, according to, I forget which one of them said it, but Wells was a little insecure about that shot because he felt that the movement drew attention to itself. Everyone now is in awe of the camera movement. They're not necessarily paying attention to the dramatic nature of the shot, which is there's a bomb in a car being driven next to the two main characters. What's going to happen? And he was much more, at least with that film, he was more proud of a scene later in the movie when they're doing the interrogation of the suspect in his apartment, and it's three different shots, and they're all done in one take. The first one is about 5 minutes. There's one in the middle that's about 1.5 minutes, and then there's the final one, which is another like 5 minute take. And he did that all on the first day of shooting. They rehearsed it for about 8 or 9 hours. And the studio executives were getting so worried because Wells went like 8 hours without shooting a scene, and then at like 5:30 at night they did it, and they did like 3 whole scenes, about 10 or 12 pages of script in about 3 hours. Wow. And that scene, technically, it's not quite as flashy as the opening, but it's much more. The impact of it's much more dramatically appreciated, I think, because it doesn't really draw attention to itself. You do have a lot of camera movement, but it's really more of just kind of back and forth. But what makes it more exciting is the way that the actors are moving and the dynamic between them. And it's really, when I was watching yesterday, I was like, man, like that's the shot. Like that's the one that like people should be studying. Not necessarily. I mean, the opening shot is really cool. It's really flashy. It really draws you into the story, but like from a technical, whether you're an audience member appreciating the drama of it, or you're a technical people like we are as filmmakers or creatives, that has both, I think, more so than the opening scene. Yep. And there's one more thing about Touch of Evil I want to bring up. So you were mentioning, John, about how Wells wanted to kind of confuse the audience and kind of make them infuriated with the ending. And of course, I don't know if I should. I guess I've got to kind of spoil the ending, but
I think it's been long enough.
I'll try not to. But the suspect in the end, admits to the crime, or the one character says, "Oh, he confessed." He the basically saying the whole plot, the whole drama of the movie didn't really have to happen because the guy was guilty of it anyway. And we all kind of take that for a fact because it's said in the movie. But one of the things that Rosenbaum and Nairmore bring up in their commentary is that not so much at the time in the 50s, but now we're more accustomed to police like beating false confessions out of people. Yeah, so we're like audiences nowadays they shouldn't take it for a fact that he really is guilty, just because they're saying that he confessed to it. Knowing what we know now about kind of false confessions and different behavior from the state, I think it makes the ending now is much more I think depressing than it was maybe in 56 when the people the general audience had more faith in their elected officials and the police and things like that. And
No.
Yeah,
I agree, because I remember seeing that movie for the first time, and that's one thing that struck me with Orson Welles was how kind of downbeat his stories are. Because like with the Magnificent Ambersons, the ending that was tacked on by Hollywood when it was recut is actually closer to the book than Orson Welles' original ending. He made it more depressing, but more realistic and more dramatic. At the end of Touch of Evil, I remember just thinking, does this movie even have an answer? Like, does it even, like, you don't know who's faking in it. It's like, by the end, I was just kind of like watching it for the experience and seeing how the characters kind of like moved through this almost needless drama, like you said. And then the other thing, like how you were talking about, like the opening shot of Touch of Evil and the fancy camera work versus the very stagey, simplistic, but very dramatic apartment interrogation scene. It just reminded me of a quote I remember hearing from some random documentary once about Amélie, the Jean-Pierre Jeunet movie from like 2001. And that movie, like, he has some of the most fanciful camera work you can imagine, like the most imaginative cameras going upside down and over bridges and all this stuff. And then at the very end of the movie, it's simple reaction shots when the dramatic heft of the movie starts. And he purposely said, I knew I had to calm the camera down because that's not what it was about. It was about the characters and the story and the action, just recognizing that. So when you were talking about those two scenes being held side to side, that's the first thing I thought of was that quote, because I remember hearing that, and as a filmmaker and a creative, it's like I took that so much to heart with my own stuff, knowing when to let the characters speak and when to show off.
Right.
Anyway,
And
rant done.
There's a funny story about how there's a shot in The Lady from Shanghai. It's a very simple shot where it's the lawyer character of Everett Stone, played by Everett Stone, and then Rita Hayworth. They're sitting on a bench and they're talking, and it's just this really simple like dolly in. You know, it's like 2 minutes while they're speaking. They just dolly in from like kind of a wider shot to like a medium close up, and in one of their interviews with Welles and Bogdanovich, they were talking about that scene, and Bogdanovich goes, you know, I was watching it and I realized that's all one take, and it's probably one of the slowest dolly shots I've ever seen, because I was looking at the edge of the screen and seeing how it get closer, and Welles goes, well, it probably isn't that interesting of a scene if you're looking at the corners of the frame to see it, you know, sliding
I love
in.
that.
You know, so he was kind of, you know, criticizing himself or you know like making fun of himself, like, well, like I guess I didn't do a good job making the scene interesting if you were paying attention
That's
to
the first thing you noticed
of the camera.
Well,
yeah,
but that wasn't what you noticed the first time you saw it, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I only noticed it after hearing, you know, Bogdanovich say that. I think I was like,
right,
like, yeah, oh yeah, it's true. Yeah, that's really
funny.
like.
I think it's also like how you were talking about it's Peter Bogdanovich. It's like, it depends what you're looking at when you're watching the movie too. Like you go into Citizen Kane knowing about the cinematography and knowing about the exceptional reputation it has. That's part of what you're going to be looking at. Whereas like the scene you just described in A Lady from Shanghai, right? The very slow push in, it's like psychologically it's supposed to mean like, oh, you're getting more intimate, the scene's getting more intense, that sort of thing. And I would imagine first time viewers, they don't even notice it. Like the casual viewer almost, who are focused on the story. So I think it depends on the audience to an extent, who is watching it and what are they looking for in Welles.
And I think that also speaks to his character and his personality. I think he was much more humble than, you know, people would expect someone like him to be, because they expect, you know, in real life they expect to see the same Orson Welles that they see on the screen,
big, bombastic, you know,
and
animated
he would
character.
sometimes play to that depending on who he was talking to. Like I know, for example, another Bogdanovich story is that at some point, like early in the friendship, Bogdanovich said he didn't really like The Trial, and Wells was like, "Yeah, like I'm not really a fan of that one. I think I'd be." So
It was his favorite.
Yeah, he kind of you know, submitted to Bogdanovich not liking the film because he didn't want to hurt Bogdanovich's feelings by saying he liked it so much. And for years he would always refer to it as, "Oh, that movie Peter doesn't like." And then it wasn't until some years later that I don't know if he had said it to Bogdanovich or Bogdanovich had heard him say how much Wells liked, you know, like The Trial. And Bogdanovich asked him, "Oh, like, you know, you said all those years, you know, you agree with me." And Wells said something to the effect of like, "Well, I didn't want to like hurt your feelings, or like I didn't want to, you know, have this too big of a argument with you about it." Like you know, he just wanted
you know, your opinion's valid, and I'll agree with it.
And there's another story too that I think it's Jonathan Rosenbaum. He met him once in Paris, and probably around the time he was making, I think he had just F for Fake had just come out, and Rosenbaum's observation of Wells is that he was someone who had a really big ego, but he was aware of how big his ego was. So he really tried. He really made a really big effort to check himself and to not show off, not to really try and downplay his ego. And I think that's really interesting, because you would think that Wells would be just all. I mean, he is a really all-consuming person on the screen. You would expect him to be like that in real life, and it seems like he really wasn't. It seems like he was much more of a friendly bear than his detractors would give him credit for.
Yeah.
I mean, what was it?
No, go ahead, John.
Because I was going to say, like, he was the member of some like magicians society, if I remember, and he was a member for it for his whole life, like up until late in his life, and he went to their regular meetings and everything. And it's like, just imagine you're like, like a little birthday magician, you play in New Jersey and you go to some kid's birthday parties and Orson Welles walks in. And it's like, hey guys, what's up? It's nice hearing a story like how humble and everyday he was, especially when you hear about the magician thing or any story like that. It's like, okay, yeah, that checks. That makes sense. And it's refreshing. We'd like to take a brief moment to thank you for listening to Storyweavers. For the enjoyment of our listeners, we want to keep this podcast ad-free and uninterrupted.
If you would like to support us further, check out our options on Patreon. Plus, subscribing will get you behind-the-scenes content, bloopers, access to Book of the Month polls, and more. We appreciate any and all support.
Now back to the episode.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, getting a little bit more personal, but when did you discover Orson Welles, and when did you fall in love with him? What made you fall in love with him, and what made you want to pursue his, watching his filmography and learning more about him? And then as an extension to the question, and we'll talk about this more in the next episode, but what inspirations you draw from him in your own creative endeavors?
I mean, I've always loved cinema, and I knew from a really early point in my life that I wanted to be, some kind of filmmaker, actor, just involved in cinema. And my taste changed growing up, watching different films. And at some point I had heard of just Orson Welles and Citizen Kane, and Citizen Kane is the greatest film ever made. And but I never really watched it until I know exactly when I watched it, because Citizen Kane premiered on May 1st, 1941, which is my birth. I was born on May 1st, 1990, and I'm pretty sure, I think it was 2005 when Turner Classic Movies had Citizen Kane on at 8:00 on May 1st, and I had nothing better to do as a 15-year-old on a weekday night or something. So I was like, I've always heard about this movie. Let me watch it and stuff like that. And that was it. I was like
enraptured.
I was just like, what is this movie? Like, what is going on here? And I knew I had to learn more about Orson Welles, and I tried to seek out as many movies as his as I could. And it's kind of interesting, because at the time, it's strange. It's I think 18 years ago now. Crazy to think that 2005 was 18 years ago.
No kidding.
I feel old.
But the rights to a lot of Wells's later work were always in dispute for decades, and they've always been like really hard to find. And some of them had like kind of fallen out of copyright, so there'd be like really low quality copies available. And so it was really tough, in that kind of in the mid 2000s, to find some of Wells's work on home video, on home media.
And for a little perspective, if I'm not mistaken, in 2005, Google hadn't bought YouTube yet. So like it wasn't even really. But my point being, like, back then you couldn't just like go online and find a website to stream a movie,
Right.
legally, illegally, whatever. It wasn't as easy as it was today.
I have a Bay of Pirates to thank for being able to find some of Wells's later films. I watched I think I watched both The Trial and Chimes of Midnight on like these really low, like 480p transfers, really bad quality. But even then, it was still like, wow, like they still had like this power to them. And it made me appreciate more, I think, later in life when, I think in the last like maybe 6 or 7 years, they've untangled some of the legal issues regarding his films. Criterion has put out so many of his movies in really high quality. There's been, the Chanel. They just did a restoration of The Trial for its 60th anniversary, and the clothing company Chanel was the one that paid for the financing of it for some reason.
I was going to say, was that the Chanel? I think it is.
Yeah. They
Wow.
they just had some money. They just they came out earlier this year. I watched it in the Film Forum in New York City, and it was incredible because I'd never seen a copy of it in such a good quality, and it was like seeing a whole new movie, and also just seeing it in a movie theater was an incredible experience. Even though Film Forum is kind of small, unfortunately, not to dig at them, but it was still like you're in a dark place with an audience, and seeing a movie in that, whether it's
the way it was meant to be viewed
or film, yeah. But it was really interesting that like his films were unavailable here for so long, and it's only after his like 100th and the centennial of his birth when he was getting really good restorations of his work and stuff. And but yeah, at 15, seeing those films, and as a teenager, I remember one of the first things I can remember like kind of buying on my own with my own money as a adult. I was 18. I just graduated high school. I had some high school graduation money, and Barnes Nobles had this really big book called Orson Welles at Work, and it's one of the best things I ever bought. It was like $80. It was at that point it was the most expensive thing I'd ever bought on my own. And I've read that so many times in the last like 15 years. Like I'll pick it up and I'll just like open up through like a page on like Othello and just read about, it's such a detailed book. And I think having that book at an early age really influenced my ideas for what it is to be a filmmaker, and not just the filmmaker, but like an independent filmmaker. Wells was really that prototype for what a lot of us are now, this being independent, making films on your own, and he was 100 years ahead of his time in some ways, I think.
That's cool.
I think I just want to say, I just think that Wells is as famous as he is, as appreciated as he is. I still think there's so much more that can be said about. I still think he needs much more appreciation than he gets. Even though he gets a lot, he is still kind of the godfather of cinema and American cinema. But I think that's still not enough praise for him.
He gets a lot. He gets a lot, but I think his films
Citizen
probably
Kane
Citizen Kane, and a couple of his films probably get a lot more than he does nowadays.
Well, it's like I would almost say like that Citizen Kane's the one dominating factor, and that just kind of like overshadows everything else.
Everything else, yeah.
Because Citizen Kane was him playing with his friends, essentially. You get Greg Toland, Robert Wise, and Orson Welles was like, I don't know how to film, help me. And it's like it was like this great collaborative experience. And his later films start to hone his eye, I would say. So I think you start to see more of Orson Welles in his later films. I mean, you see a lot in Citizen Kane. I'm not saying you don't, but I hope what I'm saying makes sense. So I just think a lot of his later films.
Yeah, a lot of his later films are surprisingly different. They're similar to Kane, but stylistically they're actually very different than Kane. And later in life, he would say that Kane was like probably the worst thing that ever happened to him, because for the rest of his life, everything
was a shadow.
It so overshadows.
Kane. Yeah, and
I mean that and Worlds.
And I think some of his later films are just too avant-garde for most audiences.
Cerebral.
Unfortunately,
F is fake, or F for fake.
Touch of Evil, Other Side of the Wind. I mean, they're extraordinary films, but they're not something that you can kind of just casually watch. They're not something you just put on and they're like you're gonna watch a Wells movie, you're gonna be kind of speechless afterwards. It's gonna have an effect on you.
So for the people who either maybe have only seen Citizen Kane or are not familiar with Wells' works, what films other than Citizen Kane would you recommend they start with?
Definitely, A Chimes at Midnight, The Trial is fantastic. I love The Other Side of the Wind, which took him 40 years to complete. I'm a really big fan of Othello. I think that's visually his most exciting film. The editing, I love it. I love the story about, he took 4 years to make it on and off in Morocco and Mogador and Venice. And I think, that one he made totally independently. He had no outside money other than his own. And it won the Palme d'Or at Cannes in '52, I think. I think
Oh, wow.
that's yeah. I think that is really that's Wells at his most
Wellesian.
his most Wellesian, I think. And I love. I mean, it's a little hasn't aged too well because he's playing the role of Othello, which is this black part, and he's born in Wisconsin. But so it's a little not quite as correct as certain audiences want today. But I think I'm getting on a tangent of Othello, but he had actually that's another podcast episode. But yeah, I think like Othello is a great it's a great place, a great film to watch. I think that's probably my favorite of his. I think Othello, The Trial, Touch of Evil, Chimes at Midnight.
Yes.
F for Fake is fantastic. I mean, just watch all of them. Just start in order and watch his career develop, I think.
All right. Well, Josh, we want to thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about one of the greatest filmmakers, American filmmakers, personalities of the 20th century, and of cinematography in general. It's fun learning a little bit more about him and some of the unique things that make his work stand out. And so we'll wrap this one up here, and then we're going to continue on in episode 2, talking about Josh's film Analogic, which came out in 2019? No, 2021. 2022. Wow. Mm-hmm. Got that way off. I apologize. And we'll learn a little bit about that film. If you want to watch it before the episode, you can find it on YouTube. Josh Pomponio, Analogic. It's a short 20-25 minute film. Absolutely phenomenal. And so we will catch back up with you then.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yep. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Storyweavers. As ever, we're incredibly grateful to all of our listeners and contributors. Come back next week for the next installment of Storyweavers.